Good morning, everyone. Thank you to all students from Sciences Po, leaders, and young people from around the world for being here today. I am delighted to introduce our first panel discussion, Enabling Next Generation Political Participation. To kick things off, let me ask you a question. Who here is part of Gen Z, so born after 1996? Please raise your hands. Wow, a lot of you. That's great, because today is all about you. You are part of what we call the next generation. You are the youth that we will talk about today. Currently, young people aged 15 to 25 constitute a fifth of the world's population. Shaped by the tech revolution, climate change, evolving finances, and the COVID-19 pandemic, our generation sees the world differently. This also includes political participation. Certainly, many of you are already politically engaged. Voting and party membership offer traditional forms of political participation. Activism, manifestation, and civic engagement represent a more individualized approach. The integration of technology into our daily lives offers new ways to express opinions, share thoughts, and connect to like-minded people around the world. Last but not least, education, civic programs, and projects such as the Youth and Leader Summit today enable young people to be the catalysts for a more sustainable, functioning, and democratic society. With more than half of the people of the planet going to the polls this year, democracy and political participation are put to their biggest test yet. So being politically active will be even more important for young people this year. I believe we can bring in fresh ideas, new leadership, and a positive outlook. However, only 2.6% of members of parliament globally are under 30 years old, despite half of the world's population falling in the same age range. Reason enough to include more young people in decision-making, right? Certainly, there's room for improvement, since women also remain largely underrepresented. In that regard, I am more than pleased to welcome 5 accomplished women from different regions of the world on this first panel. They will provide us with a unique opportunity to explore how young political participation is being shaped around the world. I would like to introduce Pilar Garrido from Costa Rica. She's the OECD Director for Development Cooperation and former Minister of Planning and Economic Policy. Benedicta Lasi. A politician from Ghana, the first African woman and the youngest person to serve as the Secretary General of the Socialist International. Louisa Porritt, she's a former member of the European Parliament from the UK and also, in fact, a PSIA alumna. Antonia Lara Pop, a master's student in international security at PSIA, who has been working for the Romanian and the European Parliament. The debate will be moderated by Catherine Porter, a journalist and international correspondent for the New York Times. Many of you sitting in Ofib with me today will become tomorrow's leaders. So let's engage in a meaningful debate. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you an insightful and lively discussion.
Hello, can you hear me? Clearly, many of you at Sciences Po are socialists. It's very French. So, in preparation for this panel, I was thinking about the topic. I've been a journalist since the 1990s. Oh my God. Those of you who said you were Gen Z, since before you were born. Anyway, I found this article from 2003 that I wrote called Young Voters Baffle Experts. And it starts saying, there is a laundry list of theories they've assembled for why polling stations today will resemble seniors' conventions. Basically, my point is that in my time as a journalist, I've written about why youth don't vote, how people like Bruce Springsteen has tried to address this in the United States to get youth to vote, what the consequences of that are, which seem even more pressing today given climate change, and some of the solutions. It is what we call in my industry an evergreen story, which means it's a story you can do over and over and over at almost any time. And I haven't seen it change very much. Although an article that one of my colleagues at the Times wrote in 2020, it said that polling 24 countries, every single one, youth voted less than the general population in each of those 20 countries. But there were some, like Sweden, where they voted at 86%. The difference was that Swedes generally, the general population, vote more than 86%. And one of the solutions was that if you get everyone to vote more, young people will vote more. Anyway, we have this amazing panel here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from them. Basically, people from right across the different parts of the world, so it will be very interesting to hear their personal perspectives, some of their personal stories, and some of their thoughts and solutions. And then we'll leave some time for questions near the end. So maybe I'll start with Maria. Maria, can you tell us a bit about your own personal experience as someone who was young, who got into politics, what you think the barriers are, and what from a personal perspective, but also policy perspective, what you think the barriers are and the problems?
So thank you very much, and I'm so excited to be here today and this wonderful female panel as well. So first of all, we have allowed me to, we just conducted a survey in the OECD to find out what were the reasons that were blocking and there were challenges for this more political participation of youth. So out of 65 youth organizations that were part of our survey, and we just found out that 71% of them said that the possibility to have enough resources to fund their own campaign. And then, so resources available for us, and or for you, I guess I'm not anymore young. The second one was about limited possibilities that were opening in political parties, like the more traditional part, that was 51%. There was an idea that it was not enough room for this. And then traditional stereotypes portraying young people as inexperienced, 47%. And of course, the more legal barriers that we have thought about that are like minimum age requirements. It starts at some positions at 35 years old, so it's already a bit late. In my personal experience, my family really loves politics. And when I was a little child, my grandma used to take me to those kids' elections. And I don't know if this happens in other latitudes, but in Costa Rica it's a big thing. It gets portrayed in the main media channels. So you would actually get those results, and everything was around policy and debating politics and dinner. So it was a big thing. So democracy mattered in my family, and it also mattered. And so I got that germ and how you could make it your own mission and how you take it forward. I went into politics because I still believe, and I will always believe, that politics and policy are a powerful transformational tool for change and more collective things that bind us together. So this is also why I do development and development cooperation, because that is also ways in order to enable that change. In my personal experience, I was not like you in office and in a political representation position. I was the youngest minister, however, and that was challenging for two reasons. First of all, because they thought that 13 years of experience on the ground and with the EU and with UN in the United Nations was not enough, so they still thought I was very inexperienced, even if I I had the background and the experience, and I knew what we were doing, and I was still portrayed as inexperienced. So in every meeting, I started sort of losing the game, 4 goals, and spare me the metaphor with football, but 4 goals against 2, so it was always very challenging. And in the end, it worked out, but I always felt I was in a disadvantaged position because I was young. And the other thing I wanted to add, there is also a gender dimension to political participation. Sometimes the social norms also affect you. So being a young woman in politics, it's harder in some latitudes because you are in a position where you have to prove yourself 4 times as much. And that was also part of the challenge. And I think in some areas, it is still one of the barriers that we have to overcome, and we have to enable the right context for this to happen.
Interesting. Thank you very much. I think we're just going to bounce back and forth a little bit around the world. So I'll turn to Benedicta and ask you about your own story and the challenges, to get involved in politics that you've faced.
Thank you. And thanks once again for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you here today. Yes, I started as, not as a progressive. I was born in a family where my dad was a conservative. And so I was socialized to be a conservative. And getting into the university, I read political science. I started reading about ideologies and realized that my own personal values were opposed to conservative values. And so I had to make a very tough decision as a young person in the university and say to myself, yes, my dad supports one political party, but as a young person who also believes that my views and opinions mattered, I didn't necessarily have to stick to that ideology. And so I actually joined the Social Democratic Party as one of its young activists in the university. And that became more or less a conversation amongst a lot of my colleagues who believe that, yes, knowing me and knowing my family, my elder sister being also involved in politics on the other side, I became the one that actually decided to go a separate way from what people had expected me, or the political party people had expected me to join. But I realized also that activism among young people were influenced by a lot of other things. You realize that in Europe, when you talk about political participation, not just by young people, but by the general population, how politics has been organized historically, it is such that you have systems that try to improve on representation and also ensuring that people are represented in parliaments. The interest groups are also sort of accounted for. Now, when you look at other continents like Africa or other parts of the global south, a lot of politics is organized not around formalized systems, but for instance, Africa, political parties and political movements have been organized around the struggle for independence. And so you have this strong sense of activism that seeks to champion equality, that seeks to sort of correct a certain wrong that people believe has been perpetuated. And this then translates into how young people begin to engage in politics, begin to become activists, because once they believe that there is a cause to fight for, once they believe that one particular political party represents their values, it doesn't become a question of which ideology it is, but it is sometimes underpinned by ethical consideration, the fact that there has been some racial marginalization. And so we have this very different perspectives when it comes to why and how we engage in politics. But as young people, I think what we have to understand is that we owe it a duty to ourselves and our communities to be engaged on the issues. If you look at political parties around the world in different countries, yes, there are youth wings, and the youth wings creates the platforms for engagement. But not a lot of us think that we can be part of the youth wing of a political party. A lot of young activists now want to focus on issue advocacy rather than necessarily supporting a particular political party to advance that vision. And that then creates a situation where we have a lot more issue advocacy rather than having young people within the traditional political setups to advance this vision that they have of how the world should be. Yes, we are young people, we are passionate about doing the right thing, ensuring that there is equality, that there is eradication of discrimination, that there is development around the world. But what we need to understand and appreciate is that in as much as protest movements are important to achieve, let's say, the particular issue that we are advocating for, being part of the formalized political structures are also very key to the development of our countries. When you look at the youth wings of various political parties, we've not seen a lot of youth wings focusing so much on policy. And this is also based on a lot of historical considerations, and it's peculiar to certain countries. You have young people being very focused on the campaign, on getting out the votes, but not necessarily the policies that would ensure that we have equality development across board. And we have to have these conversations within the traditional political systems to ensure that we are able to translate our desires into reality. And I think when the former president of Chile was mentioning that, yes, the difference between ideology and pragmatism is how you translate your vision into reality. If you look at the political parties, they create the platform for elections. So I happen to have served as the youngest person on my manifesto committee for my political party back in Ghana for our 2020 elections. And it was an eye-opener for me because I realized that all the policies that the government sort of implements when they are in government starts within the political party. And so if you don't have young people involving themselves in the process of policy formulation within the political parties, you would find out that, yes, the parties would have their say and have their policy documents presented to young people. Young people might also make some or question certain things, but not necessarily having direct inputs into it. And so what I would say is that in as much as our activism is important, we have to be strategic on where and how we are activists. We have to pick the battles that can be won. We have to make sure that we are not just speaking, but we are speaking to the right people. We are pushing the issues on the right tables to ensure that our vision, our desires, our optimism, and what values or what goals we believe that as young people must be prioritized become a part of the core policy document of political parties. That is the only way we can ensure that, yes, indeed, the parties would listen to us and they would take that into account when and how they govern. And so I would end on this note and also indicate that for young people, we can say that we are future leaders, but you have to acknowledge that future can be tomorrow, future can be later this afternoon. And so we have to always be prepared for that leadership. Thank you.
Awesome. I like your future could be this afternoon. That's how my editor feels like when I have to file. It's by this afternoon. Louisa, can you tell us, I mean, you were among the youngest liberals elected in London. Can you tell us about your experience personally, how you got into it, and what what the barriers that you see exist?
Sure. So first of all, let me say how great it is to be back at PSIA. It's bringing back a lot of memories for me. I was sat in your place once, so don't think that there is anything you can't do. The European Parliament, so I was actually the youngest Liberal Democrat MEP, just slightly beat Nick Clegg. And I became deputy leader of the Lib Dem delegation within Renew Europe about a month after becoming an MEP, knowing that we were at that time about to leave the EU in 3 months' time. So, you know, we had some challenges before us, and that's before you get to all the issues around being a younger person, standing for election, and then being in elected politics. I think what I learned from my own experience is that you can derive a lot of strength from being embedded in your own community. So I started out campaigning locally, and I stood as a local councillor, and I actually stood in my home ward where I grew up. And knowing a community and its residents really well and what the issues are, because you've lived and experienced them, will help you a lot. But then also, if you are fortunate enough to get elected, I was actually, the council I was on, Camden Council, kind of skewed young, which is really unusual in the UK. A lot of councils are older, typically, and there are structural reasons for that. So that's one of the barriers, actually. Financially, it's very difficult to sustain not only being a candidate, as Pilar pointed out, but in local politics, as a councillor, we received an allowance, but not a salary. But you know, you still have the same expectations from your community in terms of the work that you're going to do for them. So if you're in a full-time job, that's a whole other inbox you've got to manage, and that's evening meetings and being out in your community on the weekends, attending events that are important to people. And you know, it matters to do that because of that point of being embedded, but it's a lot to ask of a young person in your life, you know, when you're trying to develop other things in your personal life, in your career outside of politics, if you're doing, you know, something that's part-time rather than a full-time political role. So those are some of the issues, but certainly that experience of being embedded in a community, learning what the issues are from a local level, seeing how governance works at that level, because admittedly, as a younger person, I didn't know anything about how councils ran. Even once I got there, I was like, what is this, all these departments, what do they do? And I learned a lot very quickly about how much local government is actually in charge of. So, you know, if I was to dispense any advice to all of you, is don't write off local government and the experience of it, because a lot of decision making and implementation of national and regional policies happens at that level, including, you know, a lot of issues that particularly impact young people, like housing and climate change. The schemes that are happening in practice are being implemented at that level. And then putting the European Parliament and local politics aside for a moment, the most recent role that I stood for was Mayor of London. And I believe I was the youngest candidate for that ever, certainly the youngest woman, and definitely the youngest Liberal Democrat candidate. I actually found by the time that I did that, I didn't face too much kind of, obviously there were times in my career where you encounter that meeting point between misogyny and ageism. And I see a lot of nodding here, so everyone's experienced it clearly. I hate to tell you this, but it's inevitable. But please don't let that put you off, because actually if we don't have more younger women in positions of power, we're never going to solve that structural problem of where the bias comes from in the first place. So that's also really important. You know, once you get there, what do you want to do with that position of power, with that platform? At the end of the day, you are there to represent people. And if you are a younger elected politician or candidate, you're in such a privileged position you can't claim to be a voice for everyone in the younger generation. Obviously, there's a whole variety of views out there and generations. I can't claim to speak for you as Gen Z, but I can certainly listen to you and try to take up your issues and, use that platform to be a voice for you as well. So I kind of made that a bit of a mission in all my roles. But yeah, there were still moments, even when I stood for mayor, that I encountered that bias. For example, I did a very personal profile interview with a journalist who shall not be named. And the article started with, "This political spring chicken." I'm going, if I was a man, would I be a rising star? Yeah, so there's a bit of that. But at the same time, most people did treat me with respect, to give you a bit of hope. And, once you open your mouth, if people know what you're talking about, it makes a big difference.
Can you just, before we move on to you, can you just tell us how much you were earning, like how much you earn when you're a councillor at a local level?
Sure, so it was only £11,000 a year, and that is taxed as well, which is obviously not enough for a young person to live off. Rents in London are just as high as they are here in Paris. So yeah, it's not a wage, it's not money you can live off, and therefore, if you are younger, you have to work as well. Even if you want to put your heart and soul into that political role, that's not financially feasible for a lot of people, and obviously that then sustains this problem of elitism in politics.
And clearly retired people, like made for retirement.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Last but absolutely not least, Antonia Laura, will you tell us a bit about your thoughts about your own story and the barriers that you see?
Thank you so much. Before talking a little bit about how I see the things and how potential solutions can be found, especially right now since we are in the biggest electoral year in history, I want to frame the discussion in the sense that in order to enable next generation political participation, we need to first acknowledge the vulnerabilities in the sense that we know what is not political participation. It's not political participation to consult young people regularly, but note all their problems down, put them in a report, forget about it, and put it in a drawer and never, ever touch upon that problem again. Youth political participation is not having a youth ministry that when a coalition is being formed, nobody wants it, because it doesn't have that much power. And certainly, I don't believe that youth political participation should resemble the fact that we have youth NGOs that go and talk with the leaders have photo ops with them, but when it comes to the real policy issues, they are not heard or they're not followed up to. My experience was actually as being the youngest advisor of the youngest and conservative chairman of the Defense Committee in Romanian Parliament right when the war in Ukraine broke, and realized the fact that we need to have some consistent legislation that we as young people there working for the parliament can push to make sure that our country is secure. We have the tools to make sure that we are not in a position of being vulnerable from a cybersecurity point of view when it comes to Russian attacks. We need to have a legislation that will enable a fair but pragmatic engagement with actors such as China and so on and so forth. So I was quite fortunate to be part of that team, again, trying to show that conservatives too can have young people at the forefront that design legislation. But most of the time, we have to acknowledge the fact that young people's presence in the policy spectrum is rather tokenized and is rather seen on the topics that are for young people, which are education, labor, youth policies, and so on and so forth. What I think rather we should do is see the youth needs as horizontal and approach them in a horizontal way. And for that to happen, I think we can work on two solutions. First, what we have right now at the European Union level, and I think it is a very great policy, and I would want more member states to implement it, is the European Union's youth test, which basically makes the policymakers accountable when they push a certain legislation, be it at the local or regional or national level, to justify and think about the impact on the younger generation. And yes, it might be just a test, but once we will see more than 3 at the moment member states implement it, I think us, the younger generation, can have that hook through which we can go to the ones that represent us in the parliament and make sure that our problems don't end up in that drawer. And second, I think that we should really work on our trust deficit. The rise of populist movements we see nowadays, they are a product of our trust deficit. And for that to happen, I think that young leaders, present, and us, the future young leaders, the people that will be in office, can acknowledge the fact and be very pragmatic about it. Maybe you will not be able to resolve all the problems for your younger generation, but if you do it just at least for one people, for acknowledging the work of an intern that is working in your ministry or in your department, I think that it is a step forward. And fostering this mentorship space and this intergenerational dialogue is more important than ever. I will end my brief introduction with the fact that for us young people nowadays, we can argue if youth political participation is a right or a duty or a responsibility, but I think seeing how much is happening right now, it is a moral mandate to stand by the values that we believe in and we need to protect by being skin in the game, by being on the ground and in the heart of the policy process.
Thank you. You know, I was just thinking, sitting here, you know, in Paris, very close to the National Assembly and not that far, very close to the Prime Minister's office, in fact. Like, here we are in a country that has the youngest president it's ever had, and as of last week, the youngest Prime Minister it's ever had. And, you know, will this change the game at all? We have the youngest leader of the far-right party, who is said time and time again in the media that we'll be facing perhaps against the Prime Minister in the next election. Is this a sign of change? Is this a good thing? I guess that is sort of thinking about that, I would like to talk about solutions and what you've seen that works in your own personal lives and in your work. What do you see that works that helps young people get elected, get them involved politically, have them succeed when they are elected and they are in power? And I have to start. Maria, is it Maria or should I call you Pilar?
It's okay.
Both, either?
Normally my friends.
Normally your friends call you what?
Normally my friends call me Pilar, but
Pilar,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Pilar, can I call you Pilar then?
Yes, and all of you too.
Then I better call you Maria. No.
No.
Pilar, let's start with you again.
Yeah. Yes. So my angle. Let me start with the institutional perspective. So my angle is, as you know, OECD and particularly development cooperation in OECD. So in terms of development cooperation, we believe there is a very important role in terms of enabling the right participation of youth in political processes and in thriving democracies and in engagement and all of that. We can, I can give you 2 examples, and And we are, like some of Africa is very important in terms of priorities of development cooperation. Perhaps you could also challenge that at the moment with the recent ODA figures. I'll take it too. But you can say that the median right now in terms of population in Africa is 19, right? So that tells you a lot. But when you see and I know you could speak about this more, but when you see inside, like most of the governance structures have very old men as leaders, right? And there is this social normative system and a lot of legal regulations that preempt the participation of the majority of the people to actually be as part of it, as part of the system. And we have recently there is the recent Afrobarometer. It says that when they ask young people about democracy, they defend it still a lot, just like old people, and they think about the rule of law and all of it. But what was interesting in that Afrobarometer, in the question that was asked, was if they believe that if the thing about trust and the thing about complying with what you promised that Michel, the president, had mentioned before, it is very true. If there is a sense that you are abusing the power, the trust and the sovereignty that was deposited in you and in your program, then they would be the first ones to challenge, and the first ones, the Afrobarometer reflected this, to actually support a military coup. And you can see the news and see how that reflects in real life. So strong support, but if there's this sense of abuse, they would be the first ones. So then there is a food for thought there. And the example that I was going to bring to the table is something that UNDP did, so cooperation through multilateral channels with the CSO youth organization in Nigeria. But it was actually a platform of organizations, and the exact name is Youth Agenda on Political Participation. And they were brought together voluntarily, of course, in order to review the constitution process and the idea that was the constant dialogue and policy shaping process. And of course, they participated in that, but moreover, over some times, this also served as a place where they came together as youth leaders, and then that transformed in 2023 in something that's called Not Too Young to Run, which was a campaign movement, and then a lot of African leaders got elected for the first time in office, given that experience. So what would be the lesson that I take, and you could of course, reflect on it and think about your own lessons. But for me, it is also the power of coming together. It is my fight is your fight too, and yours. So it is our common fight, and your fight as a collective is also mine, because it is a common fight for something that's much broader than all of us. It's like a collective goal, and in that sense, I think that youth cohesion led to more political space, and there is value in coming together and acting together, and you could actually see the results. It's not enough. It's just the first step, as you mentioned. It's not enough to get elected or to get to office. It's actually the program and what you do after to enable other people and other young people to come in and actually to shape policies adequately so they respond to what they care about, climate change or governance or housing or unemployment, the things that we struggle with, that we will as young people, that you struggle with as young people. Yeah.
Okay. You know what, let's just jump to Louisa, because she just sort of nodded to you for a second about your experience when you were in office and then running for mayor. What do you think helps? What works that you've seen? What do you think could work elsewhere?
Well, I think there is cause for hope. I mean, you mentioned the example of France. My friend Stéphane Séjourné, who entered the European Parliament at the same time as me as the French delegation leader of Renaissance, is now the Foreign Affairs Minister as well here. So we've got quite a few young political leaders in France. And I think there's a lesson that can be learned there. But also, what inspired me a lot when I got to the European Parliament is I wasn't an outlier as a younger woman. There were lots of younger women elected in my cohort, and having that solidarity and other people going through the same thing as you to learn from, it's important to impart your own experiences, but also to have that network to learn from each other. And In terms of improving youth political participation, I mean, there are things that political parties can do to lower the barriers for younger people to enter politics. I do think there needs to be more across the board financial support and mentorship programs, recognizing that youth is one of many barriers for people as well. There are some diversity programs in place that political parties are introducing, but remember every element of that, and particularly when people face intersectional barriers, they need that support. And then there are things we should do to improve youth political participation more generally. It doesn't matter if people don't want to stand for election. We're all citizens, we all have a voice, and we should all use it, but we should make it easier for young people to use it. I find it outrageous that in the UK, for example, voter registration is not automatic. So the burden is on young people and all people to sign up to vote themselves. You should be automatically registered, and then, maybe the option is to opt out rather than to opt in. And another thing would be making 16 and 17-year-olds eligible to vote. I think that's really important so that young people have an incentive to be more engaged with politics from a younger age. And in addition to that, starting at a younger age with political engagement, civic education, that's not uniform across all our schools, and it really should be. I mentioned that example of me not really knowing how my local council worked, even though I'd lived in that area basically my whole life. Why was that? I was never taught about it, and I think we should all be taught from a young age about all levels of decision making and how they impact us, and we should find ways to make sure that young people are engaged in that process even before they have the right to vote. And then this experiment has actually been run already of having 16 and 17-year-olds having the right to vote in the Welsh Assembly and the Scottish Parliament last year. And unfortunately, they found that it didn't really have an impact on the number of young people who voted. Now, the lazy response to that would be to say, oh, why didn't they just sign up? Like, that's the one thing you've got to do, sign up and go and vote. But I look at it differently. And I think that if you did have that automatic registration, then more young people would have voted. And then if you can vote at 16, it makes sense to be able to stand for election at that age as well.
It's so interesting. When I covered an election in Haiti, there were these giant pieces of paper with 30 options. And they had the face and then the party's symbol. And so you needed, like, often people, there's a high literacy rate, they remember the symbol. But I was going with a gentleman who was like, I only know the one. I don't know any of these other. And you realize, like, a lot of you can feel stupid going to vote. Like, it's not that easy, and you have to do quite a bit of homework before you get there. And so I think that's also a barrier that people feel like, oof. Yeah. Now, you can tell us a lot about youth voting in many places in Africa and youth political involvement. What have you seen from your background with the Socialists that works, that gets people active? You've already sort of talked about the importance of getting people working in policy and not just bringing out the vote. Can you tell us a bit about more what you've seen that you think works?
So I'd say what we've seen in some particular countries is that where you have political parties that prioritize youth involvement, you tend to have them also having young people in leadership, which inspires other young people to get involved. Because you cannot have a greater role model than another young person being in leadership and you believing that you could also aspire to be just like that person or even greater. And so those role models play a key role in getting young people involved in the political process. And it is incumbent on those in leadership, young people in leadership, to actually then serve as examples, recognizing that they are not necessarily representing themselves, but they are representing a wider group of people or demography. What we've seen is that a lot of young people are apathetic to politics, and also one can ascribe that to the trust deficit that has been mentioned earlier. Because yes, parties promise, politicians promise to do certain things, and they come to government and they do not do them. And as young people who are very optimistic, who are very, what's the word? But we almost purists in terms of our expectations of what politicians should do. And I think when the former president of Chile was talking about going into government and realizing that sometimes it's not all the policies that you say you're going to do that you are able to do, it is important that political parties and politicians are able to own up to that. Because when you look into the eyes of voters and make a promise, and you come and you suddenly change your mind, or you suddenly neglect that and make it seem as though, oh, it was never part of our agenda, then it creates that mistrust. It deepens the mistrust, and it makes people feel that, you know, we don't even want to be part of this. And that is why we've seen a lot of protest movement. That's why we are seeing a lot of military coups in Africa, because people are just feeling a bit tired of the cycle of politics. That we have an election, there is a voting, we have hope in this government, a new government is formed, we have hope, and then they realizing that, okay, not much has changed. And so that lack of consistency sort of creates a very difficult problem for politicians and political parties to deepen the trust they have with people. When you look at a lot of young people involved in politics and how that translates to representation, what we've noticed is that, yes, sometimes the parties would want to say, yes, we are electing a young person, we are electing a woman, we are electing somebody that represents, let's say, a minority when it comes to a particular setup. But it's not necessarily translated into real policy change. If you're electing or you're supporting a woman for a particular position, or you're supporting young people into positions, we should see that also translate in your youth policy. We should not hear that in some countries, the age that makes one eligible, my country, for instance, to be able to run for president, you have to be 40 years. So, and even people who are 50 are considered young people. So you can imagine if it is set at 40, it means that anyone before the age of 40 cannot even aspire to lead. And it might not necessarily be the case that if there was no age barriers, we would have younger people running. But to set that bar that one should attain a certain age to qualify to lead is in itself a deterrent to a lot of young people. You're talking about young people voting, the 16, 17-year-olds being politically active and being allowed to vote. When you do not have a system that includes a lot more young people and it sort of restricts youth participation, what you find is that along the way, they begin to lose a lot of interest, not necessarily in governance, but in their participating in the process. They feel that this is not something for us because we are excluded from the get-go. We have systems like that actually create a lot of financial barriers to young people being able to participate. And I'll use some countries that I've had to do a lot of work in to say that maybe in Europe you don't necessarily require a lot of money to run a campaign, but in some other countries, without the money, you don't even start. And we do not have the systems of fundraising that you probably have in Europe. We do not have the systems that allow political parties to be able to support their candidates. So you have people going into elections and going into primaries with their own funding. And I had to go through that myself because, I mean, how as a woman difficult it is to raise funding to support your political journey is, I mean, it's something that is undescribable. And you have political parties where it's not just about a party, but it's a group of parties. You describe seeing about, I mean, 3 different sheets. In DRC, we have over 1,000 parties. This is the reality in some countries. And to be able to get into those parties and be relevant, it requires a lot of financial commitment. And as young people, if you do not have that financial muscle, you don't even dream to get there because you know that at the end of the day, you might have the right policies, you might be passionate, and you might have the right intentions, but if you do not have the financial muscle to pull that through, it means that you are just going to fail. And so why go into something when you know you're going to fail? And I think from the research you've done and looking at how young people are able to come together and support each other, yes, it works. But in terms of the extent to which it works, we have to look at that again. Because the systems are such that it's almost frustrating, it's almost stifling to have young people emerge from the process if you don't have political parties actually holding the hands of some of the young people to say, we are supporting you to go for this. Young people on their own can hardly get that far in politics. So this is, for me, this is a way to say that, yes, we have barriers. Yes, young people are committed to being involved in politics. But as we discuss how to improve this representation and participation of young people, we as young people must begin to think of how we fight the systems that hinder our participation. Thank you.
So interesting. So you've already started talking about the trust deficit. What do you think about fixing that? What have you seen that that helps the situation?
I think that the biggest and requirement, first and foremost requirement we need to work on to repair this trust deficit, not only when it comes to politics, but governance systems in general, and our country's way of doing things is actually having the educational institutions step up and train voters to be harsher voters, to be voters that are watchdogs in a society, to empower this watchdog attitude, because when it comes to having young political leaders in government, yes, it is important, and I wholeheartedly stay by what you said, that being there is just the first step, but what you actually do in terms of policy, it is a far more complex issue. And I think what triggers people to really get up and go, not only vote, but actually invest time, energy, money even in a cause they believe in, is seeing that there is room for sustainable change, and change that is actually visible, not just for the people that are usually active in a society, but for regular people, for people that work, are active, but are not necessarily following the news or the political movements in the certain area. So this watchdog attitude, and starting with the NGOs that already do that and are struggling with money and need funds, I think they need to be empowered to follow up. I think this is something that we as a generation need to understand. Have patience, follow up with your requests, follow up with your leaders that you elected a bunch of times and maybe they didn't do nothing yet. Go back in history and see their promises, hold them accountable. I think this is the first step in doing that. And I would be rather optimistic, ending in an optimistic note, because yes, it is very hard. There are certain barriers to political participation, but let's also face it. Today, being in a party, it's not the only way where you can be politically active. Maybe it's a blessing, maybe it is a curse. It wholeheartedly depends on us, on how we see the simple fact that we are engaged in social media, engaged in following a certain politician, asking the right questions. This can be a form of political participation that is inclusive. But we need to acknowledge the fact that we are here in a position of advantage, and when we arrive in a certain position, to do more, and I stress do more, not just say, to widen this bridge and create new bridges for the people that currently are not as active as they could be.
Interesting. So I promised to open up to questions. I just wanted to ask the room, like, I took my kids to vote. I'm Canadian. You can do that in Canada. Is part of the duty to sort of teach them about voting and talk to them, took them to political debates. Is that something that you have all done with your parents? Can you put your hands up if you have gone voting? If that's something that you can do in France, you can take your kid to vote with you? Yeah? I don't know. You're not from France. You're from many different countries. You can in France. Okay, good. And the other thing I was thinking is, in Canada, another thing I saw that was really smart, and talking about what you were saying, this collegiality, and you have a club when you're not alone, were these boot camps, like these boot camps for young people to get involved in politics, weekend boot camps where they teach you, like what you need, what your press operations should be, how much you need to raise, where the toilet is in the building. Like these are important things, and it's something that if it doesn't exist here, you should think about starting. So I promise to open to questions. I'm not quite sure how this is going to work. Oh, I see how it'll work. There's a microphone right there, and there's another one there. Does anyone have questions they want to ask? Great, come on up and please tell us who you are and who your question's for.
Good morning. I'm Harshad. I'm a student from the School of Public Affairs. I have a question that any of the panelists can answer. So, growing up in India, I observed that most of the young leaders belong to a political family. And that hasn't changed today, unfortunately. And even if there are able young leaders who don't belong to a political family, they are put aside to support a legacy candidate. So yeah, that's. Have any of you observed that situation in your respective careers or countries? And what are the potential solutions to this problem? Thank you.
Good question. Who wants to take it? You want to start?
Yes. So I think, judging by my own example, yes, I wouldn't say I come from a political family. My dad was just a sympathizer of a political party, which I deviated from to support another party. I think young people and society in general must begin to make this clear that there's no need to sort of hold on to legacy opinions of our great-grandparents, just because at the time we believe, or they believed, that a particular political party served the interests or their views of what should be achieved in the society. So I think that as an example, using myself as an example, I have not necessarily been a supporter of the saying that, just because you are in a party means that your children or your nieces and nephews must also be in this. And I think we must be open in having those conversations. And also, when it comes to the political parties themselves, I think in countries where you've had the evolution of political parties, where parties change, alliances change all the time, we don't tend to see that. But where you have countries with, let's say, two-party systems, like the US, like in my country, Ghana, it's almost as though people just have two options to choose from, and so there's not a lot of diversity in the parties that they can support. But I think this is a question of education, political education, and educating young people that, yes, you can decide for yourself which party to support. She said she goes with the kids to vote. It means that I have to interrogate that a bit more, whether or not she lets them choose for themselves which candidates to vote for. I don't know how educated they are politically to make that decision. But I think it's something that with the right political education, we can sort of get people to be open-minded about their political associations and beliefs. Thank you.
Pilar,
Thank you.
Pilar
Yes,
wants to.
Just very quickly, so that we all speak. So I would say I would take it from from an institutional perspective, but more like a governance perspective. It has to do with regulation. I think you have to remove some of the barriers, some of what it has to do with financing. It has to do also with the fact that you start with this civic culture and you put the building blocks from the very beginning, so that not the traditional groups of power take over. You really need to support the possibility of other people coming out of the system. When I was a minister, I wasn't coming from a particular group of power. I was my own woman, just like you. So that is also very good, because you're autonomous and you just owe yourself and people on a program. So it is very important, reflecting on also what we have been discussing, to create your own network based on thematic priorities, and that responds to a broader political commitment that was taken when they voted for a program. So I think you should not, knowing that breaking those groups of power and turning it into something transformative and thematic, where you build your platform from a different way, but you're not alone. You're put together in a cause, being climate change or adaptation, or being democracy, peace building, being, you name it, right? Human rights, so that you also put your own forward. So where there is elitism and groups of power that are very deeply rooted into traditional mindsets, you do your own sort of platform and then you open it up. That's my view.
Just a final thought on this. I think the question kind of referred to the existence of political dynasties, and obviously that's a more acute problem in certain countries, although, we can think about that in different ways. I mean, look at Bill and Hillary Clinton, for example. And I do take the point that sometimes being in that environment is what encourages you into politics. When I was growing up, we certainly had political discussions at the dinner table. I didn't agree with all my family members on everything, but that's, part of that early engagement that you never know how that's going to come full circle, I guess. But there are also, I think there's another way of interpreting political families, which is this idea of a closed club, essentially. I mean, just to take a UK example, David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister, is now the Foreign Secretary in the current Conservative government. So it's easier for some people to bounce back if they move in certain circles. And obviously there's a whole thing about having a certain pathway and privilege and education that engenders all of that. So these are one of the barriers we need to break through as well. There should be really another candidate for Foreign Secretary. That's not to dismiss his experience for the role, obviously, but how many other Conservative MPs are there? That may be a reflection of the talent running out at the end of a dying government, but there are, young MPs there who would be just as good in that position, I'm sure.
It's so interesting. I mean, I think you could also look at France. We have a government now run by someone who was not part of either legacy party, and that was unheard of. And there's the reverberations of that continue, but it's quite interesting in a country with an old democracy like France that you have someone that did not come up through either party structure, although he was a minister in Hollande's party, he was not a socialist candidate. And although it's not necessarily a family dynasty, it is also a question of those support structures you come in with. You're the chosen one by the socialists, you're the chosen one by the LR, or not, and how you get there. I think which one of you was here first? Whoever was here first.
2024 is a year of, I think, over 60 countries having elections, actually. So what you're speaking about is really relevant, like a super election year. I think 2 billion voters. And my question to you about that is, so I think, Catherine, you mentioned you were overseeing elections also in some countries?
No, I was just a reporter, like, doing reporting in polling booths, yeah.
Related to that, what opportunities are there to help in those elections? I know one of my professors, he oversaw elections, like checking the waiting lines, counting the votes in an African country. Do you recommend CS students to apply? Is it even possible at this level, or is it something only for professionals? Yeah, just curious.
Who wants to take that on? How about you? Do you know about how you can get involved to watch the vote?
As an elections observer, so usually, maybe I would give just the process. So usually if it's an institution that is applying or wants to observe the elections, they have to engage the Electoral Commission and express that interest of wanting to observe the elections and also indicating what the team members are. In terms of the various elections we have, the countries sometimes decide which observers to allow. And so it's really at their discretion. So I cannot say for a fact that if Sciences Po is to apply to observe a particular election, that would be granted. It's entirely up to the country in question. But I think being involved in the process and you taking active interest in these electoral processes is something that is an eye-opener for a lot of people, understanding the electoral processes. But one of the institutions that I worked with from a distance, actually, is the International Federation of Electoral Systems. I think it's in the US. I think it's in Washington. And all they do is focused on elections. And so this is an organization that you can actually look them up and see the work they are doing. And I don't know if you can intern or engage with them, but I, as International Relations Secretary for Ghanaian students many years ago in 2010, I actually engaged them to undertake a workshop in Ghana for young leaders who were into politics as well. So there are a number of institutions that can facilitate this, but I cannot guarantee that any application for a particular election observation mission would be granted. Thank you.
Oh, I have no idea what you're saying. One more. That's a 2. Okay. At the same time. Gotcha. We didn't train before this. Okay, 2 last questions, and maybe you can ask them one after the other, and that's what we're going to do.
Thank you very much for the lively debate. It's been great following the discussion. So my question would maybe be for Louisa Porritt, since it concerns the EU. And it's also about elections. So we know that since the first elections were held in the European Union, voter turnout decreased, except in 2019, when voter turnout increased for the first time. And we know, according to research, that this is also due to youth participation. So what do you think, will this trend continue in the future? And what can we do to make sure that it does?
Don't answer yet, Louise. We're going to get the second question. And you're the last question, the woman behind you.
Hello, my name is Mahar Ramethi. I'm a student diplomat from Anwar Gargaj Diplomatic Academy in the United Arab Emirates. As someone that is active in, or hopefully will be active in politics in the future, and you as women that are active in politics, my question for you, and shedding light specifically on women in Sudan, women in Gaza, those that are suffering, what can we as women that are active in politics, what can we do for them? What can we do to push our governments to protect them from governments that are unable or unwilling to protect them?
Wow, okay. Okay, let's start with Louisa. You could answer the easier question.
Thank you, great question. I mean, I hope so. I hope this is a trend that will continue. I think the thing that was notable about 2019 is the rise of populism. And I think there was a big pushback against that, and young voices were obviously really important in that process. Listen, that threat, I don't have to tell you, hasn't gone away in Europe, across Europe, including in the UK. So even though we won't be participating, unfortunately. So hopefully it will continue, and actually, you know, you all have a role to play with all these elections coming up this year, to make sure that you do vote in those elections. I'm sure you will, you're Sciences Po students, but also talk to people that you know and encourage them to vote as well. There are friends my age who don't necessarily, you know, see political engagement as mandatory and important as I do. And there's a lot of minds you can change. You don't have to be telling them how to vote even, because people won't always listen to you if you do that, trust me. But getting people to vote in the first place is so important. And I do think that there's work that, you know, the institutions themselves, that political parties need to do to reach out, to encourage people to want to vote. I think, you know, particularly in the European elections, sometimes the institutions can seem quite remote. And then the onus is on the existing MEPs to show people that they are doing work for their constituents, not just something in Brussels where they're pursuing their own interests. There's a happy middle ground between, you know, that policy making at the European level, which is so important, and representing your community. So it's a bit, you know, there's effort to be made on both sides.
And does anyone want to address the second question, which is sort of a humanitarian imperative, what you can do, what we can do as women watching what's happening in other parts of the world to protect other women? Even, I don't think it was necessarily related to voting per se or getting politically active, but facing.
Maybe just to say that I think this would be going to be addressed in the next session, but more broadly, I think the process of peace building, when women are involved in processes of peace building, those peace building processes are more durable and are more successful. Because there's like a more complex way of understanding this. So I believe that in general terms, that is one of the most important ways in order to set those building blocks for later. And that requires, and it has to come through a lens of political participation with peace means. And then there is another angle of this, and is the humanitarian response. Our committee is the one that deals with assistance and development and is addressing this humanitarian angle as well, and sort of looking at it into a more complex perspective where the gender dimension and the women perspective is also going to be part of one of the major building blocks of that response in the moment and going to the future as well. So, yeah.
Anyone else? Well, I think that's it, unless there's someone else who wants to add. Thank you. Thank you very much. Or did you want to add something?
Yeah, no, I wanted to just talk about the importance of advocacy and why in such circumstances the platforms of advocacy, and actually looking at the various engagements that are going on, the various government initiatives or international cooperation initiatives that are being undertaken, and trying to take a pointed approach of advocacy. Let's look at the upcoming big events in Europe that are looking at this, the European Parliament. What petitions can we take to them? How do we demand that certain actions are taken? And I don't know if your question relates to how you as an individual can do this, but I think as a collective, it is important that you find the platform that enables you to have colleagues or compatriots that believe in the views that you hold, and look at how to constructively engage some of the institutions that take decisions on this matter. And I think it is not just a question of talking about it, but really putting on paper what exactly needs to be done. Thank you.
And last, go ahead.
Yes, and a very brief comment to this, I would add the fact, because I read your question in a key of foreign and security policy, which some countries, for them, basically, it's something that is like rooted in their identity politics. If you go and watch what politicians on different sides of the spectrum say about their foreign and security policy, you couldn't say who is a conservative, who is a social democrat, who is a liberal democrat. Why? I mean, like, young leaders should really push the politicians into having more creative policy options for these questions that seem so big and unapproachable, because actually this means political participation is also about competition and a healthy confrontation of ideas. And when you have this competition, some win, some lose at the elections, but ultimately democracy wins, and it is the most important thing.
Thank you all.